gang, welcome to Scuba Diving Magazine. Now, one fundamental piece of equipment that we use as divers on all of our dives is a compressed gas cylinder. And I was trying to work out how I could possibly make a top 10 diving cylinders without just listing, oh, here's like a 12 litre, and it's number one. I figured that was a bit boring. So whilst I was thinking about diving cylinders, how to make a video out of them, I thought, oh, you know, a bunch of facts just kind of popped into my head about cylinders that I thought that you might get a kick out of. Dive cylinders have two important pressures, a working pressure, which is what you normally fill it up to, and a test pressure that the cylinder can actually be filled to without, you know, exploding. Now, there are a handful of working pressures out there, but the three most common ones are going to be like 207, 232, and 300 bar. Those are the pressures that you fill the cylinder up to and the pressure that will be listed whenever you're buying a cylinder. But you can actually fill the cylinder to 1.5 times that working pressure as like a safety buffer. Now, you should never actually fill a cylinder to the test pressure for obvious reasons, but you shouldn't worry too much if the cylinder is filled a little bit over the working pressure. Too much and you can actually damage the thread of the valve, but like 1 or 2 bar, it's not really the end of the world. When you actually fill up cylinders too fast, they can get hot as well, and you actually lose some pressure when it starts to cool down later. That's when you're on the surface, you check your regulators, you check how much gas is in your cylinder. Okay, I've got 200 bar or whatever. You jump in the cold water and all of a sudden you've lost like 10 bar or something. That's why. So basically, if some fillers, if they're in a rush to fill a cylinder, will actually overfill a cylinder so that by the time the cylinder itself cools down, it'll drop back down to the working pressure. So that's another reason to give cylinder fillers as much time as possible, because you want to do it as slowly as possible so your cylinder doesn't get hot and you end up with less gas in your tank. Some cylinders actually float at a certain pressure, and you can actually float them like a balloon underwater or send them up to the surface if you're done with it. Now, steel cylinders, whether they're full or empty, they will sink. Steel is just heavier, so it sinks. But aluminium tanks weigh a lot less than steel cylinders, but they displace a little bit more water because it's a softer metal, so the tank walls have to be a little bit thicker. So they're now more buoyant because they weigh less and they displace more. Now comes the clever part. Air has some weight to it. Granted, it's not particularly heavy, it's not a good workout, but when you take a bunch of air and you cram it into a tiny space, it can actually affect the buoyancy and the overall weight of a cylinder. You can actually get to the point where you can tell if a tank is full or empty just by picking it up, because heavy tanks are full and lighter tanks tend to be empty. So the buoyancy of an item is all about the weight of the item and the weight of the water that the item displaces. So when you put it in the water, the volume of water that that cylinder is taking up, if you weighed that, it's all that kind of equilibrium as to whether it floats, sinks, or it's neutrally buoyant. Some aluminium tanks start off weighing more than the water they displace, so they sink. As you breathe and you exhale the gas inside, they gently become neutrally buoyant because you're losing that gas weight, and then eventually positively buoyant, so they float. That's why it's important to do a very proper weight check, and the best time to do a weight check is with a near empty cylinder at the end of a dive. Another difference between steel and aluminium tanks is that steel tanks tend to have curves where aluminium tanks tend to be flat. So aluminium is such a soft metal that they're usually made using extrusion, where they basically take a block of aluminium and they push it into a mold with thousands of tons of force, and the metal is kind of squeezed out around the mold. Steel is much stronger and it utilizes a similar method, but it's more about bending the metal into the shape instead of squeezing it. They flatten it into a plate and then they just bend it until it eventually turns and turns and becomes a cylinder. And they're usually made with round bottoms for efficiency. I say usually, it's just the more common ones that I tend to use. But flat bottoms are very handy because you can stand the cylinder upright without a boot, but it requires more metal, which can make the buoyancy of the tank a little bit different because you've got a bit more weight at the bum end, so it tends to be a bit more sinky. Now, there are about 3 cylinder bottoms out there across both steel and aluminiums. If you look hard enough, there's the completely rounded bottom, which is quite common where I'm from. Completely flat, that's usually with your aluminium cylinders. And then you actually get concave flat, which is a bit more popular in some other areas. Either way, it's important that you look after the bottom of your cylinder, as they can get damaged over time because that's the bit that you tend to put down and it kind of wears away, so do be careful with them. When cylinders empty completely, they can gasp as a final breath. It's all gas rushing out, and then the fine little bit after it rushes out, it sucks in. This is why you're always taught to never breathe your cylinder completely down to empty, or just to let it vent completely empty. The inside of your cylinder is a funny environment, and if any contaminants get on the inside, mainly moisture, they can really damage the inside of the cylinder, which can weaken the strength of the cylinder, which you do not want. If the cylinder has pressurized air or gas on the inside, every time you open that valve, the air is in such a rush to get out, it prevents anything else from getting inside. But if there's no pressure inside, then moisture can find its way in and cause havoc. Worse is if the tank is underwater, because it's going to gasp and it's going to suck a bit of water in, or a humid environment like a swimming pool room when it's completely empty, because it can suck in a little bit just after that final bit of gas rushes out. If your last air fill was more than a few months old, it's actually important that you drain that cylinder and get a fresh air fill. Air can go stale, and in some rare cases, it can actually become dangerous because when stored horizontally, contaminants then collect along the wall on the lowest part, and the high pressure actually increases the chemical reaction rate, which can accelerate corrosion along the wall of the cylinder, which is the weakest part. There are even cases where carbon monoxide have formed on the inside of stored cylinders because of chemical reactions over a long period, and you do not want to breathe carbon monoxide underwater, or on the surface for that fact. Carbon monoxide is a bad gas. So if you've stored your cylinders over the winter time, it's best that you drain your cylinder down to like 20-30 bar or something, and actually get it checked out by your dive center. Get them to do a visual test of the inside before your next dive. And if you're planning to store your tank for a long period, it's best that you drain it down to a low pressure, 20-30 bar, but not completely empty obviously, and try to store it upright. The bottom of the tank is the strongest, so it's going to put up with the most amount of abuse and corrosion on the inside. Scuba cylinders are both stronger and more fragile than you think. The old Hollywood trope of the protagonist just bashing a tank valve so it shoots off and the cylinder explodes and kills the bad guy, quite tricky and not something that you're going to do by hand. That being said, a scuba cylinder will certainly shoot around and cause a lot of damage should a full cylinder fail in some way. That's why it's very important that a skilled technician with the right parts actually assemble cylinders, because there are two threads that are very, very similar and they do go together, but they are not secure. So you're going to make sure that you put the right valve into the right cylinder. But if cylinders are damaged, if it falls over or whatever, it's best to take them to your dive center so that they can test them properly, make sure it is actually okay, especially if it's dented. A small dent from a drop cylinder can greatly reduce the overall strength of the cylinder and can cause it to rupture at some point, and you don't want to be anywhere near it. So the tank valves themselves, they're made from a chrome-plated brass, which is quite a soft metal, so a bump can bend it, and there's no unbending it without weakening it. So I'm afraid you need a new tank valve. If the valve leaks a little bit when you've closed it after a dive and you really need to wrench it closed to stop it, that's your fault. If it's your tank. If it's a rental tank, it's not really your fault. But yeah, if you need to wrench it closed and it's your own cylinder, you only have to blame yourself, unfortunately. Tank valves only need to be closed just finger tight to shut off airflow. It's the way they're designed. But because some divers think that because there's a lot of pressure on the inside of the tank trying to get out, they think that they have to really screw that handle tight to keep it inside. But that's not the case. The valve design means that you're not fighting that pressure to close the valve. It stops it with minimal effort, and every time that you wrench it closed, you're actually damaging the sealing surface and you're bending it each time. So the next time you have to close the valve, you have to tighten it a little bit more, and then so on, and it's just never-ending cycle right up to the point where you can't close that valve. It's usually a pretty easy fix, but the next time you're closing a valve, just finger tight until it stops. That's all it really needs. The stamps around the shoulders of a cylinder will tell you absolutely everything about the cylinder, including its birthday. So everything that you need to know about the cylinder is stamped into the metal that cannot be undone. So when you try to convince the filling station that your cylinder's still in test, they know that you're lying. And if you're planning on painting your tank, try to avoid the stamp section around the shoulders, because if you can't read them, then you're going to need to sand them down and just ruin your paint job. The same for stickers and wraps. When testing cylinders, when filling cylinders and whatnot, the technician needs to be able to see the body of the cylinder. When they're filling it, they're not going to tend to remove anything unless it's quite easy. But when they're testing it, the technician needs to inspect the external body of the cylinder, and stickers might be covering something up. They had cases where someone had failed a cylinder. They drill a hole in the side of the cylinder because, well, yeah, no one's going to be able to fill it up with compressed gas. Someone decided to, I forget, either like try and weld it closed or something, and then just slapped a sticker on the outside. And funnily enough, it failed. So yeah, they have to come off. And it sometimes is a bit easier if you can take them off and then you can put them back on afterwards, whereas the technician, he's going to be a bit less gentle. The colours that you see on gas cylinders actually mean something. A lot of diving cylinders are just bare metal, and they do come in a bunch of colours as well because we don't really conform to the industry standards. The most common colours are going to be yellow and white for scuba diving cylinders so that they stand out a bit in the water, but actually white and yellow means what's inside of the cylinder. Around the shoulders of quite a few cylinders, you'll probably notice like black and white quarters, and of course the yellow and green diamonds for nitrox cylinders. Now, we're not as strict as other industries, but we do get some crossover because the color and the shoulders denotes the cylinder's contents. So black on a compressed gas cylinder means nitrogen, and white is oxygen in international ISO codes. So black and white shoulders is a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, which is basically air. So that's a compressed air cylinder. In America, they use yellow for air and green for oxygen. That's where we get the yellow and green from nitrox. Helium is brown. I think that's pretty universal. So if you see brown on a cylinder, that usually means it's helium for trimix. Dark green over here is argon for dry suits, but in the States I think it's blue. But yeah, the color of the cylinder actually means what's inside of it. Your cylinder testing is really comprehensive when you take it to a dive center for obvious reasons. It starts with a visual check of the external condition of the cylinder. I mentioned that earlier. Stickers and wraps and boots are removed from the cylinder so that they can check the entire external size of the cylinder for any corrosion or even like sort of dimples in paint, because in some cases rust can travel underneath the actual enamel coating. You can usually see this kind of bubbling effect to it, so that's what they're checking for. Then when the cylinder is completely vented and empty, the valve is popped out so they can check on the inside. They usually use one of those scopes with a light on the end, and they check out the inside of the tank again to check for corrosion. Both the thread in the neck of the cylinder and the valve itself is tested with go and no-go gauges to make sure that each thread hasn't stretched or warped or pitched in any way, and they're both exactly the correct thread to go together. That's your basic visual, but a hydro test. Your cylinder is lowered into a pressure pot, which is filled with water. Your cylinder itself is filled with water, which I know is a usual no-no, but they dry it thoroughly afterwards. And that amount of water is connected to a little gauge on the outside of that pressure pot, because basically if something goes bang, it just goes pump. You feel it in the ground, but you're safe. And that little gauge, you can see the water level change as the cylinder is pressurized. It's pressurized to the test pressure, and you can see how much the tank expands by the water level. But more importantly, you can see if that water level returns to what it was when it depressurizes. Ideally, it should return to exactly what it was at the start, but if it doesn't, that usually means that your tank has stretched a little bit, and now of course it's failed the test. There's a bit more to it, but that's a quick breakdown of what happens during a cylinder test. Afterwards, yeah, they re-sticker it, they stamp it up, so it's good to be filled for another however long, depending on where you live. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's 2.5. But yeah, that's a quick breakdown of what happens. If you have any interesting facts or stories about scuba diving cylinders, then let us know down in the comment section underneath this video. Another useful thing for when you're buying cylinders is that they actually make them in batches, and if sales are a bit slow, it's not unusual for a cylinder to sit on a shelf either at the manufacturer or at the dive center for a few months before you buy it. And it doesn't matter when you buy it as to when it needs testing, it's actually when it was made. So do pay attention to that when you're buying a cylinder. Double check, or at least ask when it was manufactured, because if it is like a substantial amount of time, maybe the dive center can do something a little bit for you. But yeah, double check how young and when the birthday of your cylinder was when you're buying a new one. For more scuba diving content, remember to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up if you could. And remember to check out our website, scubadivingmag.com, and all of the work that we do over there. Thank you for watching, everybody, and of course, safe diving.